Thank you to everybody for coming today. I always appreciate the chance to chat with all of you, and here we are on a nice Monday lunch hour here on the West Coast. So thank you to everybody for being here. Before we begin, I will say that, as you may know, we are largely a donation-supported organization, and now more than ever, the work we do depends on everybody. So if you are inspired by this talk today, or if you are in support of our organization's conservation work, please do visit our donate site listed here and become a member today. We would love it. The title of my talk, I think, like all talks, deserves some definitions. And California is a big place. Rangeland is a big kind of all-encompassing definition. And I know many people have varying definitions for what constitutes the idea of Central Nevada, Central California. And right now, I am just going to take a somewhat imprecise and easy way out and slash lines through the geographic thirds of the state. And I'm going to focus on this center portion today. And I recognize that some folks would, inch those lines up or down or make them into curves to include the top of the Sacramento Valley and the bottom of the San Joaquin there, and would maybe shape portions around parts of the Central Coast. And we're going to just slash some lines across the center of the state here. Today, I'm going to be focusing largely on public rangelands, specifically those lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Most of my photos and locations that I'll be discussing will be from Bureau of Land Management property, and that is partly because some of my recent work through this last butterfly season has included surveys on California Bureau of Land Management property. The Forest Service, as you can see in this map, also manages large amounts of what we might consider forested rangelands. And in some cases, certainly the species I will discuss can also be found on these Forest Service lands, as well as obviously into parts of Northern or Southern California. The butterfly species I'm discussing are not always limited to Central California. It's just that they occur on Central California rangelands. Combined, the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service account for nearly half of all different rangeland habitats in California, according to information from the University of California, Davis. And most of the locations today, because they're on this Bureau of Land Management property, are going to be in these brown habitats here and are mainly lower to middle elevation locations, not the highest elevation locations often on Forest Service lands. Oops, excuse me. But these rangelands represent an extremely important segment of public lands that are in some ways a transition between the almost entirely private Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys and the U.S. Forest Service lands. So even though some of the parcels that you see in this map are not very large, I think they're extremely important in that way. In general, rangeland is open land where at least one use includes grazing by managed livestock like cows or sheep, and likely also includes native grazers like mule deer or pronghorn, depending on your location. Depending on where you've spent time in California, you may have a particular vision in your head as to what public rangeland habitat looks like. On the left, we have a photo from the Sierra Nevada foothills on the western slopes. The oak savanna sort of habitat that has mixed annual and perennial grasslands we'll talk about. But if you are on the east side of the Sierra Nevada, as I am, I live just over the California line south of Reno, Nevada. The rangeland that has cattle on it that you are most familiar with is going to look like the photo on the right, which is dominated sometimes, depending on where you are at, by sagebrush, bitterbrush, and other shrubs. Other habitats that also might be less familiar to folks who come from west of the Sierra Nevada are pictured here, but partly because these places are less developed and more arid and not as amenable to certain types of agriculture, they account for a large portion, the rangelands account for a large portion of the lands east of the Sierra Nevada. And they can include a variety of landscapes, We'll talk about each of these in turn, whether it's salt flats on the left or a more arid canyon with stream and riparian habitat running through the center of it, as we see on the right. And just a couple last images that convey the diversity of rangelands through those two easily drawn lines that I have for Central California include photos on the left. This is Big Pine and Little Pine Creek coming out of the Sierra Nevada near Lone Pine and Big Pine area. And in some of the higher elevation sites in the higher parts of the Sierra Nevada foothills, we certainly reach into semi-forested habitat that is a mix of shrubs and open forested land that you see on the right. Before we get into the butterflies that live in these landscapes, I think it's worth addressing some of the threats that these habitats face, because they will be shared in common across some of the butterfly species. The low and middle elevation rangelands especially are vulnerable to both local and widespread threats that can affect butterfly populations, which I have listed here. Some of these will be familiar to you, some of them may be less familiar. I do want to take a bit of time and go into each of them because, as I said, they can be shared, but they can also have different localized effects depending on where they are at. So the photo on the right comes from a 2014 publication focusing mainly on recent land use conversion of rangelands. And so the rangeland habitat that they're considering is in that light yellow color. And you can see that even in recent decades prior to this publication, rangeland is still undergoing a fairly steady transition of conversion from rangeland to other uses, whether that's agriculture, urban or suburban development, or for things like mineral or energy extraction. So this is one of those threats that is can be localized and is often found on Bureau of Land Management lands in California, because as I mentioned, they're in those transition spaces between the forested Sierra Nevada and the private Central Valley. In addition to development, one of the other major threats to butterfly populations across many different types of landscapes, but certainly in Central California, is pesticide application and exposure. This is something you may be familiar with depending on your location. But I want to point out that this 2020 study used sites that were in the Central Valley of California, and it included both agriculture adjacent sites as well as refuge sites, that is natural areas. And what we see in this figure from that paper is that the concentration of these chemicals and the presence of these chemicals, they often occur far from agricultural sites, and these sites can include refuges where we might be trying to actively conserve butterfly populations. So this particular study was looking at the presence of pesticides on milkweed leaves. And you can see that these chemicals were found on milkweed leaves, both in agricultural sites and on refuge sites, as well as in urban sites near cities. I want to just highlight those different areas here. So these are the agricultural sites, these are the refuge sites here, and these are the urban sites. These are retail environments, so I'm not going to focus on those. But you can see that there's a variety of chemicals that were found at these sites. And I want to highlight this particular chemical here, chlorantraniliprole. This chemical is used on caterpillars, beetles, and aphids on a wide range of commodity crops. And as you can see, these white dots are places where on milkweed leaves, this chemical was found above lethal concentrations for monarchs. And that included places that were agricultural sites as well as multiple refuge locations. So while this study is focusing on milkweed and milkweed leaves and monarch caterpillars, I think it speaks to the point that these chemicals are found distant from where they are applied, and that this presents a threat to many different types of butterfly populations and many different species. Another threat faced across rangelands are both arid and wet adapted invasive plants that are not native to the area which they're found at currently. These plants can compete for space, they can compete for water and for nutrients with native plants, and they can reduce the availability of caterpillar food plants or adult nectar plants that are needed by butterflies. The overall effect of these plants can be greater or lesser in different areas, depending on the environment and the plant. And some plants are more influential than others in certain places. So one I'm going to focus on a little bit that you may have guessed already by this photo is cheatgrass. And so cheatgrass can influence a number of ecological processes and feed into other landscape level changes, especially when there are initial events to kind of switch stable states, as it were, in vegetation. These can include things like wildfires. The photo on the left is from Bureau of Land Management rangeland near Markleyville, which is that photo was taken a few years following the 2021 Tamarack fire, which burned over 67,000 acres and was a stand replacing fire across much of its path. This fire has increased cheatgrass presence and largely eliminated native habitat, native plants for a prolonged period of time in this area. I recognize the ambiguity of mentioning wildfire as a weather event, but I would like to point out that the Tamarack fire was started by natural causes. And it's of course important to note that fire is an important part of many California ecosystems. These sorts of large stand replacing fires are the culmination of multiple ongoing human-driven and natural processes. And in other areas, specifically grassland ecosystems, fire suppression has led to the larger changes in the landscape when we think about things like shrub encroachment. Other landscape changes known to affect butterfly populations include periodic drought or increasingly high temperatures. The photo on the right is the Edward Hyatt power plant at the Oroville Dam pictured. The Edward Hyatt power plant there is pictured on the right from Oroville Dam. The power plant was stopped in 2020, 2021 because of drought conditions, although those have obviously changed now. The droughts that California has experienced in recent decades have been documented to affect butterfly populations across the state in recent publications. Last, but possibly not least, as grazing is a major use of rangelands, it may not be surprising that certain rangelands can be overgrazed, depending on a number of factors that can include recent weather and climate, changes in vegetation that may make lands lower quality than they were previously assessed at, meaning that they can be overgrazed by permitted numbers of livestock, or because of the presence of feral horses that have been in rangelands of Eastern California specifically for decades, sometimes above sustainable sizes. So the most recent estimates are that there were approximately 3,000 feral horses in California and approximately 2,200 as a sustainable population size. So the overgrazing is going to be spread out according to those populations. Okay. So enough on the threats for the moment. When it comes to the butterflies of Central California, there are probably somewhere around 240 species of butterflies that can be found in that Central California region I drew out. Many of these species, though not all of them, can be found on rangelands, and so I have a few that are pictured here. So when it comes to where to find these plants on the landscape, there is certainly a mantra of find the plant, find the butterfly to some extent. Butterflies obviously do have wings and can disperse and do disperse between habitats, but they, as they need the plants that they feed on as caterpillars, they are going to be less likely to be found far from those distinct plants. And so here's just an example of this with the large marble butterfly. The large marble, as I'm going to talk about, feeds on mustard plants. And so this relationship with the mustard plants is not just something that the caterpillar has, it is a lifelong relationship between the individual and the plant. As you would guess, many butterfly species lay their eggs directly on the plants that they're going to feed on as caterpillars. The large marble is no exception to this. And so this butterfly egg, as this large marble egg, is here on the terminal flower bud, which is essentially the only place that we find large marble eggs on these mustard plants. The Caterpillar is going to feed on leaves or possibly flowers and fruits of this plant. And though many caterpillar species wander off of these plants to find a safe place to pupate, this may also include a dead mustard plant that is on the ground nearby, or they may wander onto a lower branch and pupate there. And so they are, even though they may leave the plant to find a safe place to pupate, they are never far away. And then lastly, as an adult, of course, the females are going to be strongly attracted to their host plants so that they can lay eggs and continue their life cycle. But adults of both sexes of the large marble are commonly found nectaring on mustard plants that they may also lay eggs on. And this is not that uncommon among various butterfly species, especially those that feed on plants that serve as nectar plants as well. They have a strong innate attraction to those plants. So today, I certainly am not going to cover all 240 species of butterflies in Central California, or even that number that can be found on rangelands. Instead, I want to focus on 4 species that may be slightly less familiar to people. These species have close relationships to very distinct rangeland landscapes, and they are imperiled by various threats that occur in rangelands that we discussed earlier. 2 of these species are widespread, and we actually have long-term data on how they are doing. The others represent more classical targets of conservation for various reasons that I'll get into, including being specialists in certain habitats. Maybe one of the most obvious rangeland habitats are grasslands, and I should put a disclaimer here first. When I talk about grasslands for this particular part of the talk, I'm talking about a broad grouping, what the conservation organization NatureServe calls a macro group, and that includes annual and perennial grasslands that include both native and non-native species of both grasses and forbs. So certainly this is a broad grouping. There are many detailed nuances to California grasslands. There are obviously many specialists on California grasslands, and I am not one of those people. I do not intend to be an expert on grasslands in this talk. I do want to point out the butterflies that I find in these habitats. So mixed native and non-native annual grasslands certainly are more common in the coastal and Central Valley regions. Perennial grasslands have been reduced largely to smaller relics within the oak savannas and woodlands of past centuries. Roughly 88% of remaining grasslands are privately owned, according to the California Grassland Organization. So remaining public grasslands are crucial natural resources for native plants and animal populations, including animals that are historically widespread, but may be now in decline. And that idea of butterflies that are in a modern decline brings us to our first species featured on the right here, the large marble butterfly. So as I already mentioned, the large marble butterfly feeds on plants in the mustard family. And so again, I am not a plant person by training. I love learning about plants and I'm doing so all the time. So I am simply trying to provide examples here of some of the native California caterpillar food plants for the large marble and the mustard family. In particular, I'm a big fan of Western wallflower, just as a gorgeous plant. But like at least a third of the butterfly species that are found in California, this butterfly species also feeds on multiple non-native plant species. So I have just a few examples that are here. Others I'm sure are familiar to you if you work in California grassland systems. So this is, as I mentioned, we have data available for the large marble, data in terms of how its populations at certain places have been doing over recent decades. And so this is a lot of data on one sheet. So if you'll give me just a second, I will divide this up for you and explain what we're looking at here. This figure comes from a 2023 paper that was put out in Ecological Monographs, of which I was a part. So these data on the left come from sites that Art Shapiro at the University of California, Davis has been monitoring butterfly populations at, sometimes for over 30 or 40 years. These sites are outlined here by color, corresponding color, and they essentially span the I-80 corridor, going from the Coast Range through the Sacramento portion of the Central Valley and crossing up over the Sierra Nevadas. This high elevation site is Castle Peak, and this site over here is Sierraville. So when we look at these sites on the left here that come from this portion of Central California, you can see that in many locations, both at low elevation sites like here along the Coast Range, as well as higher elevation sites here in the Sierra Nevada, like at Castle Peak, this butterfly has declined beginning in the 1980s from a butterfly that you would see one or about every third to one out of every two visits to a butterfly that has vanished almost entirely from each of these locations. And I guess I'll go back and just explain here. This is the proportion of visits in a given year that Art Shapiro would have seen this butterfly. So if this is at 0.5, it's 50%. That means he saw it at one out of every two visits at this site in this year. Again, if it's a 0, that means he never saw it. If it was all the way up at 1, it would mean he saw it every single visit that he went out. So that's where we're looking at these declines across the Central Valley here in California. These sites on the right-hand side come from a broader portion of the species range. And these are from the North American Butterfly Association, which has annual counts typically centered in the high summer season, where they count both the abundance and diversity of butterflies at these locations. And so you can see here that in multiple locations, the butterfly has also been in steady decline over recent decades. A 2025 study that was published earlier this year in the journal Science also includes new data from many different sites across the United States and analyzed butterfly population trends across the US. The Xerces Society recently summarized this information along with other data in a report we're calling State of the Butterflies of the United States, and you can find that at this link here. And so I wanted to highlight that in this report, we divide up some of the findings of the 2025 science paper by US Fish and Wildlife Service region. The analyses in the paper were done nationwide and at the level of US Fish and Wildlife Service regions. So here we're looking at the Pacific Southwest, that includes California, and we include all of the data. We include a summary of all of the data. We also include species level highlights of some species that are in decline, as well as species that are doing well. And you can see that the large marble is highlighted here. And that is because it was the butterfly found to be in the steepest decline in this Pacific Southwest region. In addition to the data you see here, it's also had evidence of significant declines in the Pacific Northwest. And across all monitoring sites at the species range, it had declined approximately 75% between 2000 and 2020. So we have a lot of evidence, and we're gathering more all the time, that suggests this butterfly is declining across a significant portion of its range. The photos here represent some of the types of rangeland habitats that include the large marble. And these photos span areas as far as Monterey County, which is on the top and bottom of the far left, to the Stanislaus River on the Western Sierra foothills, which is on the right side, those photos on the right, and Western Sierra foothills that are on the two inner photos. So there are also habitats that are east of the Sierra that hold the large marble butterfly. These sites in particular represent the low elevation sites that are a particular subspecies of the large marble that seems to be in the steepest decline. So I focused on that here. Just giving you a map of occurrences on the right-hand side here, you can see that this is a widespread butterfly, and there are still fairly thriving populations of this butterfly in distinct locations in the Bay Area. But the large marble, because of this widespread distribution, is subject to a large number of threats, many of which we've already discussed. So I don't need to focus too much on those here. One thing I do want to mention is I have overgrazing as a threat here, and there are not many horses in the Central Valley portion of the Large Marbles Range. But there are other types of grazing that are used for very noble purposes. So this photo is from Fort Ord National Monument. I certainly don't mean to pick on Fort Ord National Monument. I believe that the grazing they're doing here is extremely effective for the purposes that they have it. The point I want to make is that grazing and butterflies are things that we need to think about together, and we need to think about the specific species biology when it comes to grazing duration and grazing timing and grazing intensity. And so when it comes to the large marble in these grassland landscapes that may need to be managed by grazers in the absence of other natural ecological processes, that is a topic to be thought about in depth and on a site-specific basis. And I'll leave it at that for now. If people have questions, I'm happy to talk more about that. The second habitat I'm focusing on may be less familiar to those of you in central and coastal California, but may be familiar if, for example, you visited the Mono Lake area or other areas on the east side of the Sierras for your vacations. These areas I've got in the photo here are saltgrass flats, habitats that are dominated by saltgrass, Distichylus spicata, along with other low-lying nectar plants and oftentimes rabbit brush along the exterior perimeter of these habitats. The soils are made white with salts left over from evaporation, and they're often thoroughly alkaline basic soils as well. And even though they may not look like it to some folks, to other folks who know grazing, these are common grazing lands, and they also host some very specific specialist butterflies. And so I'm going to focus on one of those here that you see on the right. This is the alkali skipper. The alkali skipper, aptly named, it has several subspecies, but it is largely limited to alkali flat regions in the arid portions of the Great Basin and some portions of Southern California as well. One of the subspecies of this butterfly is the Carson wandering skipper, which is federally protected. Unlike the large marble that can feed on a number of native and non-native plants as a caterpillar, the alkali skipper feeds only on alkali saltgrass. In California, the remaining populations of the Carson wandering skipper are largely restricted to the location on the right, which is Honey Lake in Lassen County. In California, saltgrass habitats are most commonly found on the eastern side of the Sierras, both in northern and central California, as well as places in Southern California. It's these arid regions. And in addition to the alkali skipper, they can also host a number of other fun desert Southwest butterflies, including the Mojave sooty wing that's pictured on the bottom right here, which I found in one of my recent survey trips, and feeds on saltbush. These are photos that extend the length, for example, of the Owens River Valley, as well as the photo on the top comes from near the volcanic hills south of Mono Lake. And one small detail for those of you interested in butterfly taxonomy in particular is you can see the variation in wing pattern here between these two populations, with this one looking much more like the Carson wandering skipper that I showed you earlier. This one represents a different subspecies. It looks more like a different subspecies of the butterfly. And that is just representative of the fact that these butterfly populations typically have been isolated for long periods of time. There's very little dispersal between them, and that's part of what feeds into these the subspecific diversity of this butterfly. For anyone interested in plants, I assume there are many of you here, the alkali skipper nectars on some equally interesting and salt flat adapted plants. These plants typically are very low stature plants. The alkali skipper, you will rarely find it flying more than a foot or two above the ground. So the nectar plants are found there as well. So for example, even if you found, say, a Mojave thistle near these plants, I would be fairly surprised if you would find the alkali skipper on it. You might find other golden skippers on it, but you're less likely to find this one. But two plants here, one on the right is salt heliotrope or alkali heliotrope, which is in the borage family. And this is the subspecies that's flavus, which is found in both California and Nevada. And on the left is a plant in the rose family, King's Ibicea, or the King's mousetail, because of these really awesome scaled leaves here, or alkali mousetail or King's mousetail, and has some subspecies that are also threatened by some of the same things as this butterfly, because it is restricted to these salty soils for its habitat. Depending on the location of these butterfly populations for alkali skipper, historically development has been one of the main threats to this butterfly. The photos on the right are historical and modern images, the modern image on the bottom, from the type locality for the Carson wandering skipper, which is in Carson City. You can see the historical photo comes from 1985, I believe. And the center of this area has the Interstate 580 corridor running through it, which you can see here in the center. The area to the right was turned into a wetland mitigation area for the highway, which in essence flooded a large portion of the saltgrass habitat that the butterfly used. And as you can see here, in recent years, the left side of the habitat has been almost entirely developed, or is being currently developed into suburban developments. Just for context, this is from a 1999 publication discussing the Carson wandering skipper. You can see what this habitat used to look like. For most remaining butterfly populations of the alkali skipper, including the Carson wandering skipper, but also other subspecies that are found on these alkali salt flats, changes to the groundwater table that affect the presence and abundance of the saltgrass itself are likely one of the larger threats to any given particular population. But because these are typically grazing lands, overgrazing is also a threat. And some populations, I should say, of this butterfly may occur adjacent to certain types of agriculture, like alfalfa production. And in those cases, pesticide exposure represents a particular threat to those butterfly populations as well. The last rangeland habitat that I want to talk about today is broader, certainly. And all I will say as an introduction are these are the places that feel dry, even if there is a stream running through them, like in this photo on the left from Mill Creek outside of Bishop. These habitats often have a flush of spring flowers, but they can feel dry and brown for much of the summer season. But even here, the plants can support a diverse group of butterflies, including species that we know to be in decline, like this butterfly on the right. So the next butterfly is called the common sooty wing. It's also called the roadside rambler, which is an amazing name. And it might suggest that it is not a rare species at all. In fact, it does occur across the United States, and it feeds on plants that most of us would typically consider weedy in the amaranth family, including amaranths as well as goosefoots and pigweeds in the Chenopodium genus. So these are not nectar plants. They're not plants we often think about as being associated with butterflies. And they're often, again, not plants that we typically think about as being imperiled, thus imperiling the butterfly through the rarity of the plant. But when we look at trends for this butterfly, we see that in fact it has extremely steep declines in abundance across parts of California. So these graphs are similar to what we looked at with the large marble, but I'll go over them again just real quickly. These are color coded to these points in Art Shapiro's long-term data sets across the Central Valley of California. And on the y-axis is the percentage of visits in a given year that he observed that butterfly. So 50.5 is 50% of his visits in 1990. He observed this butterfly, 60% of visits at this particular site, and so on. And you can see an extremely steep decline in these Central Valley sites. Going from a butterfly, you'd see 1 out of every 2 visits to a butterfly that is not observed at all anymore. And for the North American Butterfly Association annual butterfly counts, or 4th of July butterfly counts, depending on what name you've heard, those surveys that are done just once a year at a given site. These are 3 other sites that are in the Central Valley of California, and you can see the butterfly in corresponding decline at these sites as well. In the 2025 science paper, which we summarize in our report, the common sooty wing has been found to be in decline at the level of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regions in the Pacific Southwest, which we see here, also the Northeast, Southwest, Southeast, and Midwest, as well as in the Pacific Northwest with some larger variability, resulting in approximately a 60% decline in abundance across all monitoring sites between 2000 and 2020. So before I talk a little bit more about threats, I want to point out that in this same area, we have something, it's not exactly a generalist, but it can feed on multiple plant species and is found across the United States. And opposite that, we have species like we see here, which are the buckwheat blues in the genus Euphalotes. There are roughly 15 species of buckwheat blues in California. And almost all of these, most of these species have multiple subspecies that we have organized underneath of them. In most of these cases, each of these subspecies feeds on one or sometimes a small selection of different buckwheat species in the genus Areogonum, of which there are roughly 125 species of buckwheats in California alone. So in this photo here, just to give you examples, I have 4 different buckwheat blue taxa and the different buckwheat plants that they feed on underneath. And as you can see in the photo, many of these buckwheats can be found in extremely arid locations. Anybody who is familiar with buckwheats knows this. They are plants that can be found in a diversity of locations, and many of these include habitats that feel to us fairly inhospitable. But this endemism of plant and butterfly is part of what has led to this diversification, as opposed to the common sooty wing, which is found in many different locations. So I want to highlight just a few specific things about the development of Euphalotes. I recognize that I'm not going in depth into any one particular taxon here. I am happy to try and talk about specific Euphalotes taxa. But one of the things I want to say is that Euphalotes taxonomy is one of the last great, somewhat unresolved Lepidopterous mysteries for the Western United States. So certainly there's a lot of unresolved issues that go on with that. And the species or subspecies that will be found in your area obviously are going to depend on what buckwheats are found in your area. So it may or may not be that helpful to get into a specific buckwheat subspecies here. So that's why I'm avoiding that. But many of these taxa do share many characteristics, and I wanted to point those out here. First off, unlike a lot of butterflies, which obviously feed on leaves as their caterpillar resource, most Euphalotes will be found on the flowers or feeding on the developing fruits and flower buds or fruit on these plants. Lycaenids, the blues, these buckwheat blues are in the Lycaenidae family. The Lycaenidae family has some really cool characteristics, some of which you may know. Many Lycaenid caterpillars are tended by ants, that is, they're protected by ants, and in return, the caterpillars can secrete a sugary solution through specific glands on their body that the ants then take up. And so this is a symbiotic relationship that many lycaenid species have. Another cool feature of lycaenid caterpillars is that what you're looking at in this particular photo, this is not the head of the butterfly. The head of the butterfly right here can actually be everted out. And so what this enables the caterpillar to do is to really reach inside, developing fruits. They'll actually bore from the outside into the inside and stick their reversible head into the fruit to eat it. So really fun biology. Most of these taxa, though certainly I would not claim to say all of them, most of them have one very short-lived adult generation per year. Short-lived, I mean the adult butterfly may be alive for somewhere between 5 to 10 days, sometimes less. And these buckwheat blues often nectar almost entirely on the plant species that they grew up on. And so they are what we call, they would be considered extremely sedentary species, often not moving more than 10s or 20 or 30 meters throughout most of their lifespan, hopping from plant to plant of the species that they grew up on. And many, again, though possibly not all, of these Euphalotes taxa hibernate as pupae in the soil or in leaf litter near the plant. This photo is not of Euphalotes. I want to be careful to point that out, but it's the best example I had. These are Melissa blue pupae that were pupating under a rock that was near an alfalfa plant. So I flipped over that rock that was at the base of the alfalfa plant and found, what, eight pupae under there. So that sort of habit is shared among the Euphalotes. And some of these buckwheat blues, especially those that live in arid regions and feed on plants that may have phenology that it has large variation year to year. They may not fruit and flower at all in some years. Some of these butterfly taxa have the ability to overwinter for multiple seasons. And so you may go through entire seasons not seeing the butterfly in a particular location to then see it in a future season where the weather conditions trigger growth and development of the plant that it feeds on. These butterflies, both the common sooty wing and this large group of buckwheat blue butterflies, are probably more than any other group that I've talked about today, really restricted to that interface between natural areas and rangelands and urban areas. And development of certain habitats is an active threat to many populations of Euphalotes as well as to the common sooty wing. But you can imagine it being particularly important to the Euphalotes where the geographic location of the plant population determines the extent of the butterfly population. In addition to habitat destruction from development, recreation-related disturbances that accompany urban and suburban development, like illegal dumping or excessive recreation use destroying vegetation, often represents a key threat to both of these species. And then the others you'll see here are shared in common among many different types of species. But of course, wildfire in particular and invasive plant spread are often especially intense and frequently encountered threats at that urban natural interface. So they play a big part here. As we begin to close, I feel like we should think about how we can conserve these butterfly species, which may not be federally protected at the moment, but which show a strong need for conservation in various ways. Each of these species, as we've talked about, has its own specific threats and locations. But the good news is that there's almost certainly something all of us can do to protect rangeland butterflies, even if we're not working on or living near rangelands. And so, though some of you here may work on rangelands and want to focus on solutions for rangelands, I want to point out that, of course, all butterflies have the same basic needs, including larval and adult food sources, safe spaces for development, and pesticide-free spaces. And so these are things that we can provide both on and off rangelands. And then, we've already talked about, butterflies have wings. They span different rangeland habitats at times. They span public and private rangelands. They move from developed areas into natural areas. And the restoration activities that we can take on can also do those same things. They can span private and public rangelands. They can take place in small and large spaces. And of course, pesticide exposure in particular, as we've already talked about, does not know these boundaries and is a particular unseen but really potent threat to butterfly populations that happen to occur far from the actual pesticide applications. I want to draw attention again to the report that the Xerces Society recently put out that not only summarizes the 2025 science paper on butterfly trends nationwide, but also includes a whole section on calls to action that works to conserve both butterfly species that are specialists as well as those that are widespread. And so in this paper, we break things up by land use and landscape elements, including things like natural areas, as well as what you can see here, towns and cities and working lands. And we tried to divide these actions up first to separate them by types of habitat uses, types of habitats. But then at the end, we also have an appendix that tries to demonstrate how these actions can apply across different landscapes. So while I'm not focusing a ton on these specific tactics here in this presentation, I would encourage you to go to our report and see what we would suggest as the primary first actions to conserve butterflies across these various habitats and landscapes. So just a few final thoughts here to finish up on. I hope that what I've shown you here is that rangelands are key habitats for California's butterflies, and that rangeland habitats and butterflies are vulnerable to both local and widespread threats. These rangeland habitats exist in crucial spaces on the landscapes in between privately held lands and possibly more forested lands. But our conservation actions can include solutions across these landscapes and across spatial scales. And together, I think we can work to conserve diverse butterfly communities on our rangelands and really have the shared use vision that we all hope for. So with that, I will say thank you. I've got my email address listed here if you have questions following this presentation, but I believe we have a good bit of time for questions now. So thank you all very much. I appreciate your attention.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin. And yes, just to reiterate, if any folks have questions, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A and we will try to answer some. I did want to start. Could you describe some of those calls to action a little bit more, Kevin?
Yeah, our goal was to set aside to show ways in which butterfly conservation could be integrated into existing conservation actions, as well as in general management plans and management actions for different landscapes. So, for example, in this working lands, we have a huge set of broad landscape scale actions. In towns and cities, we have some of these as well. I cut out this other page to make room. On the other side, we have a section on how to integrate butterflies into the planning stages of management actions like county master plans and things like that. So our goal was simply to provide what we feel like are the primary first steps for protecting butterflies, and largely those are reflective of the threats I've discussed today. So just for example, large-scale use of insecticides on rangelands, that's, I suppose, something I didn't talk about in terms of the grasshopper insecticides that this is discussing, but in terms of pesticide exposure, that's something that we know exists across urban landscapes as well as working lands. So we've just tried to tie those all together.
Perfect. Thanks so much for explaining that more. Okay, question about that State of the Butterflies report. Will that be published in a paper edition?
It is not one of our not one of our main printed publications. I do believe we may have a small number of them printed at our office. So I'm going to suggest to that person, if they're interested, that they send me an email and I will find out where those have been hidden at. Yeah, that's a good question. We did discuss that when we were first getting this published, and it's just been long enough I don't remember. So forgive me, but please do reach out.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I've seen a few, but again, not sure about the distribution. But you can find PDF copies on the xerces.org website. Another question here. Do you know if there are any populations of the alkali skipper in the San Joaquin Valley in alkali and other saltgrass habitats, or other imperiled alkali specialist butterflies in the San Joaquin Valley? Their organization, River Partners, does restoration in some of those areas.
There are, let me think about this. So you will have to forgive me. My limitation here is coming from exactly where the edge of the San Joaquin Valley is. I don't want to overstep where I know my geographic boundaries. So there are a couple subspecies of the alkali skipper down in Southern California, but I don't want to misspeak. So at the risk of saying the same thing again, please reach out to me and I can get that information. That's the sort of thing I can look up, but I just don't know the edge of that boundary well enough and I don't want to misspeak. But there are a couple subspecies in Southern California, so it is the sort of thing I'd like to have an answer to as well. So please reach out and we can figure that out. Sorry for not having that at the ready. Thank you for asking it.
That's all right. And yes, they say they will reach out. Okay, wondering if very briefly, we did have some questions about the large marble petition. If you could address some of that very briefly.
Yeah, I'm happy to give it my best shot. Sure.
Sure. Yeah. Someone was just wondering about the Lepidopterus letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in response to a petition, and some different data sets as indicators for the species.
Yeah, so I think I don't want to speak for those folks because they have submitted that letter, and I think that letter represents their position very well. I think that there are, what I'll do is I'll speak for myself, and I'll say that we believe in what we put forth in that petition represents that butterfly is at a significant threat of becoming endangered in the foreseeable future. So we saw a butterfly that was in steep decline in many places and faced threats across much of its current habitat. And we felt that represented a particular threat towards extinction, towards the threat of being endangered in the foreseeable future. And that's the language of the Endangered Species Act. I think that some of our differences may come down to differences in our definitions of rarity. What is a rare species and what does decline mean for a species? And can a widespread species be endangered? Those are all interpretive questions and they're ideas that are up for debate. And I appreciate that they have that difference of opinion. And I think that they represented their side well, in the sense of like they have particular points of view and their own sets of data for that. But I would suggest that the data we show are representative of a threat of being at risk of being endangered in the foreseeable future. In the same way that the Xerces Society saw the monarch butterfly at a threat of being endangered. And that is a concept that can exist side by side with a species being able to be found in many different locations. to my mind, those ideas can exist side by side, but I think that that's where the debate comes from.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
But
that
I
makes
will
sense.
say I don't want to speak for them. They have their own. I mean, obviously I couldn't. I hold a different point of view, but that's what I would say.
Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
And that does make sense. All right, I'm going to post that link to that State of the Butterflies again. We're kind of running right to the hour here, so if anyone has any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll wrap up here. I'm sorry, put them in the Q&A. I'm not following my own instructions. All right. Well, I think that's it then. If there are no further questions, Kevin, I just wanted to say thank you so much. That was so informative. Really, the detailed breakdown of the data, really appreciated that. And that roadside rambler name, that one I really like too. I'm going to go look
Good
that
name.
species up. Thank you all for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Again, you can visit our YouTube channel to watch this webinar again, or any of our other recorded webinars. Thanks again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.